the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I start by welcoming the new member for Mid Bedfordshire? Is the Prime Minister as relieved as I am that those constituents are not burdened with his defeated candidate who told them, don't worry, Mr Speaker, I'm going to sanitise this, to F off if they're struggling with the cost of living?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm proud of what this government is doing to support the most vulnerable over the past year. But, Mr Speaker, can I in fact join him in welcoming the new members to their places? After all, I suspect the new member for Mid-Beds may actually support me a little bit more than the last one.
Well, so much for being the change candidate. He can't even distance himself from those appalling comments. But I do have to ask him, where on earth does the Prime Minister think his candidate got the idea in the first place that throwing expletives at struggling families was his government's official position?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, let's just look at the record of what this government is doing to help those people.
He keeps boasting about how great things are. The voters keep telling him he's got it wrong. But I can see why the Tamworth candidate thought he was just following government lines. Annalisa and her 2 children lived in their home for 8 years. In May, they were kicked out with a no-fault eviction notice. Despite his government's pledge to scrap no-fault evictions, this week the Prime Minister crumbled to the landlords on his own backbenches and killed the policy. What message, other than the message delivered by his candidate in Tamworth, could Annalisa possibly take from that?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we've taken significant action to help renters like Annalisa and others.
Just to say, it's Prime Minister's questions, not opposition questions. Keir Starmer. I'm sorry, Prime Minister. It is Prime Minister's questions. I don't need you nodding against my decision. Yes.
Well, I'm sure Annalisa and her children who've now been evicted will take great comfort from that non-answer. Emma and her teenage son saw their mortgage go up by more than a quarter. Well, they may think this is funny. This is real life. After 16 years of dutifully paying their mortgage, for the first time, she's having to choose between new shoes for her son and putting the heating on. All because his party crashed the economy, pushing mortgage rates to their highest levels in decades. He says ignore all that. Ignore the fact that the guilty men and women responsible are standing again as his candidates and still setting his policy. Can he not see why Emma might think that his party is telling them exactly where to go?
Mr Speaker, he keeps talking about the mini-budget. I won't ask him a question, Mr Speaker, but I will...
Absolutely tone deaf in every cafe, pub and supermarket in Britain having the same conversation. We can't afford that. Put it back on the shelf. It's too expensive. He is completely oblivious, just patting himself on the back. Emily and Jamie have worked hard and saving for years to buy their own home. They were nearly there last year, but he scrapped house building targets because his backbenchers pushed him around. House building has fallen off a cliff, shattering the simple dream of home ownership for people like Emily and Jamie. Can the Prime Minister now see that actually his candidate in Tamworth was just loyally following the party line?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I think these prepared lines really aren't working for him anymore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, across our country, the British people are rolling up their sleeves and getting on with it, doing their best in the face of a punishing cost of living crisis and a government that has abandoned them, abandoned renters at risk of being kicked out, abandon mortgage payers struggling to make ends meet, abandon those who dream of owning their own house. The truth is, his candidate in Tamworth summed up perfectly just how his and his Tories are treating the British public. So will he just call a general election and give the British public the chance to respond, as they did in Selby, Mid-Beds and Tamworth? They've heard the government telling them to F off, and they want the chance to return the compliment.
Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, look, as we saw with his...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the UN warned that hospitals in Gaza had just 48 hours of fuel left to keep their electricity going. That was 28 hours ago. The electricity runs out tonight. Now, we have a human responsibility to all the people in Gaza, but we have a particular responsibility for UK citizens, some of whom are in those hospitals with no food, no water, no medicine and no way out. So I want to ask the Prime Minister, how much worse does the situation have to get before he will join us in calls for a humanitarian ceasefire? Yeah. Mr. Speaker, the growing calls for a ceasefire is also about calming the situation in the broader region, especially the West Bank. UNICEF has reported over 2,000 fatalities and over 5,000 injured children since the conflict began due to unrelenting attacks. If we ignore this, we risk pouring petrol on a fire in a place that only requires a spark to ignite. Can the Prime Minister understand that joining calls for a ceasefire is now the best and maybe the only way to stop this conflict escalating beyond all control?
Click here for our choice of the best bit of PMQs here.